Minister for Tourism and Member for Ancillary Canneries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thought that this was a very straightforward resolution put forward by the Minister of Finance. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely surprised by the level of drama and excitement I've seen so far, which has characterized this debate. Mr. Speaker, this is a very simple matter. The airport project has been conceived many decades ago and has been seen, Mr. Speaker, as one of the cornerstones or one of the important projects upon which tourism advancement and growth and development would take place. And so, Mr. Speaker, while there have been many attempts, there have been a failed attempt, for example, by the previous administration in their term between 2011 and 2016. Mr. Speaker, despite criticizing the move by the then Stephenson King-led administration to implement an airport development fee, the then St. Lucia Labour Party government, upon taking office between 2011 and 2016, did, Mr. Speaker, resort to a cabinet conclusion where the cabinet made a decision, and the document was made here in this House, Mr. Speaker, to raise the airport development tax. Mr. Speaker, I think the proposed amount was $55. But in this resolution, Mr. Speaker, which we have presented to this House, presented by the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Speaker, there are two different revenue streams. One, Mr. Speaker, is a $35 which goes towards the payment of the airport development tax. And the other one, Mr. Speaker, is an extra $38, which, Mr. Speaker, will then allow government to finance other initiatives, such as roads and so on. And we would see clearly that one of the projects that have been highlighted to be developed and implemented in this initiative is our road development program. Mr. Speaker, I will come back to the financing arrangements later. But what I want to focus on, Mr. Speaker, is the overwhelming excitement, the overwhelming expectation, and the overwhelming rejoicing and gratitude that takes place at this present time in the tourism industry. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is widespread consensus within the tourism sector that this project will take tourism to new levels. Mr. Speaker, this is a very proactive approach by our government. When we look in the pipeline, you see that not only are we growing very quickly in terms of the airlift, in fact, this winter we grew our air seats by 19% when we had 7 additional flights from American Airlines, and several US carriers, Mr. Speaker, began their winter months a bit earlier and ended the summer months a bit later, thus, Mr. Speaker, adding significant dividends to our air seats. Mr. Speaker, we have presided in this administration over 2 consecutive years of 10% arrival growth in stayover arrivals. Two consecutive years of 10% growth, Mr. Speaker. It means, therefore, that as we negotiate additional airlifts, such as the one that is coming in December 21st, when we welcome an additional flight from American Airlines out of Chicago this time, and it's a weekly flight. It means, Mr. Speaker, that this added capacity in air seats will no doubt have significant demand on the apron facility. Already when we look at the Urinora International Airport, it is maxed to the point, Mr. Speaker, that when we look at the bank of the flights and the time when they arrive, especially on weekends, it is a nightmare on our airport. It doesn't lend itself, Mr. Speaker, to a world-class destination, providing customers with a very good first-hand welcoming experience that world-class tourism destinations are required to give. Mr. Speaker, the facilitation of passengers has also become somewhat paralyzed because of a lack of space. And we've been through all of this, and there is now overwhelming consensus on both sides of this House that this project is absolutely necessary. And so, Mr. Speaker, for more than one reason, I give this my overwhelming support and my very tacit endorsement. Mr. Speaker, the terms of this loan is very, very clear, and I am satisfied, Mr. Speaker, that in the terms here, it leaves St. Lucia in a very good position of cash flow and in a very good fiscal position. Mr. Speaker, a 5-year grace period has been outlined in the resolution. In the first 5 years, Mr. Speaker, there's going to be 5.5% and a 5% for the remainder of the tenure of the loan, thus making this a very comfortable arrangement, Mr. Speaker, for the government's fiscal position to be able to repay this loan. Mr. Speaker, we've heard so much about what this would do for the expenditure, but we've heard nothing. We've seen 5 speakers stand up today, and none of them, Mr. Speaker, took the opportunity to say that in the revenue, there will be a $78 million revenue added by this initiative. And so when you hear them talk about outsourcing and all kinds of different things and trying to scare the population as it pertains to the loans or the level of loans that we're borrowing, Mr. Speaker, what they have failed to identify is that there is a $78 million annual revenue when we look at the current tourism arrival numbers. So pegged at 396,000, there's over 78 million. And Mr. Speaker, as we get new airlift and the destination improves in terms of arrivals to our shores, we will no doubt see this figure going above $80 million. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is a fundamental point, that the revenues that will be derived from this arrangement will no doubt be in good stead. But a point to note, Mr. Speaker, in the loan arrangements is that out of $73 in increases to the total airport fees, so it's presently at 25, departure taxes have been raised by $38, and Mr. Speaker, there's a $35 in airport development fee. The $35 Mr. Speaker, goes to repaying the loan, but there is still an additional $38 per passenger by 396,000 passengers, or about 40 million additional monies that government can use to finance existing arrangements. Mr. Speaker, the question then becomes, when you have an undertaking that is so viable, that has such great revenue potential, do you then, Mr. Speaker, outsource that undertaking? And so, Mr. Speaker, I think that there's great appreciation on this side for outsourcing and privatizing certain government initiatives and government institutions or certain activities of the government. But, Mr. Speaker, these blanket statements that have been made this morning, Mr. Speaker, without going through and making sure that you do this on a case-by-case basis is absolutely flawed. And we've heard it this morning. And so, Mr. Speaker, once the enterprise provides an opportunity for profit to be made, then the question becomes, who should be in control of the money? And this is the overriding difference between the two philosophies that have been posited here today. We're saying that SLASPA has proven and they have turned over profits, Mr. Speaker, and we have made it as a document of the House, and in the social economic review we see monies that they have rebated to central government from their operations. And we see, Mr. Speaker, that consistently over the last 5 years that SLASPA has been turning over profit. It shows that they're an institution that has been tried, they have been tested, Mr. Speaker, and they have proven themselves that they are capable of running the airport. And so, Mr. Speaker, when you've got such great revenue streams to play with, why would you want to outsource it and give control to foreign entities to do what you can do for yourself? That is the point. And so, Mr. Speaker, this, though, this position posited by the SLP somewhat collides with their overwhelming and vehement criticism of what they accuse the government of embracing foreigners. And you would have heard the mantra FFF, friends, family, and foreigners. And that has been their new mantra, Mr. Speaker, where they have clearly said in the last 3 years, Mr. Speaker, that there seems to be something wrong with the embracing of foreigners. But just because, Mr. Speaker, we have come in and restructured an arrangement, an enterprise, Mr. Speaker, in the best interest of the people of St. Lucia and in the best interest of our country and our tourism industry, then all of a sudden it becomes fashionable to embrace foreigners. Mr. Speaker, the MP for Labrie had a very interesting debate where he said that even if we started the airport in June, we will not have time to finish it for the elections. Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to assure the member for Labrie that what is being considered here is not politics, but what is being considered here is the development of St. Lucia. My good friend from Castries South, Mr. Speaker, spoke a lot, not that I care for his views anyway, about the consortium of banks and was calling for transparency. And then, Mr. Speaker, he was joined by his, the member for Vieux Fort South, who was calling for full disclosure on the and for transparency. He went on to say that Bank of St. Lucia was a public institution and therefore that demanded, Mr. Speaker, that we indicate who the other members of the consortium are, and we've only identified Bank of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, this is a rather strange and consistently duplicitous comment that is coming from the member for Vieux Fort South, especially, Mr. Speaker, when his silence on matters such as Grindberg and Rochemel continues to be extremely deafening. And, Mr. Speaker, while we will, I'm sure the Prime Minister is going to indicate a little later on why he can't or cannot disclose who the other members of the consortium are, Mr. Speaker, we want to assure him that everything we have done on this side has been transparent. We have told the people of St. Lucia when we will do something, and we have not allowed them to find out anything by surprises. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is in this vein that I give this project my tacit support. Then the debate went on to talk about borrowing. And I sat there and I listened and I said to myself, these honorable gentlemen, they have the nerve to talk about borrowing. Because, Mr. Speaker, you know, while we will come and political gamesmanship could be a bit poetic and could sometimes tell untruths, as we've seen many bandied around. You've had to ask the member for Vieux Fort North to infamously withdraw a comment that he made. We see, Mr. Speaker, that the numbers don't lie. The Social Economic Review of 2018, which we have made in the House, is clear with a lot of stats, Mr. Speaker. And I want to share some with this House, which Mr. Speaker, will totally debunk all of the statements made by the opposition and all of the scare tactics that they have attempted this morning to posit. So, Mr. Speaker, the member for Vieux Fort South said that borrowing in recent times have been at unprecedented levels. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know you know your numbers well. You will remember very well in 1997 when the previous administration, led by the same group, When they took over the management of this country, the debt to GDP ratio was somewhere in the region of 40%. By the time they left, Mr. Speaker, in 2 short terms, it went over 50%, Mr. Speaker, and it got close to 60%, an almost 50% increase in the debt to GDP ratio. Mr. Speaker, the debt stock of this country was doubled by this same administration. But the difference is, Mr. Speaker, is that they were spending the money on infrastructure projects that weren't given an opportunity to generate revenue. In this instance, Mr. Speaker, we are building an infrastructure project with a tremendous opportunity, and that is generating wonderful levels of revenue. And that's the big difference here. And so while we see that there's going to be $78 million generated, the ability to repay this loan is well within the capacity of this enterprise and this arrangement. And that is the big difference between the two sides here. Mr. Speaker, I want to take a moment, Mr. Speaker, to also reference some other indicators in the social economic review. So, Mr. Speaker, commercial banks, a lot has been made about the level of borrowing that we are doing with the commercial banks. Mr. Speaker, I thought that banks exist to lend money. And I thought that if banks weren't lending money, then business is bad. Mr. Speaker, there has been, since 2013, 6 years of decline in the credit levels according to the Social Economic Review in the commercial banks. But, Mr. Speaker, in their liquidity, since the last 5 years, we have seen, Mr. Speaker, that their liquidity has increased by almost 100%. So we see, Mr. Speaker, that whilst the liquidity of the banks are getting a lot stronger and solid, we see that there is, Mr. Speaker, commensurate with that, happening at in the same period, a significant decline and a consistent and steady decline, Mr. Speaker, on an annual basis since 2013 as it pertains to the bank. This, Mr. Speaker, paints a very sorry picture for the financial industry. And so, Mr. Speaker, what this loan is doing, it is giving a new lease on life to the financial industry, Mr. Speaker. And so here we have a local bank that is leading a loan that has the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to trade money, to sell money, to put it in layman language, and to make a profit, Mr. Speaker, and to ensure that within a very important sector in the economy, the financial industry, that there is some level of sustainability. So this loan gives the financial sector a great opportunity to do so. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that my support for this is extremely strong. I want to commend the Ministry of Finance and their staff for putting together a very good arrangement and a very solid proposal, Mr. Speaker. And I have absolutely no concerns about the terms and conditions of this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I think that it is a very happy day for tourism. It is a very good day for jobs. And it is a very positive day for the advancement of the economy of St. Lucia. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.